savage barking of foxes broke out below the house among the willows. "That will be the relief," Junius continued. "Pardon me, Miss Morgan, isn't it? I'm Junius Maltby, and this gentleman, on ordinary days, is Jacob Stutz. Today, though, he is President of the United States, being burned by Indians. For a time we thought he'd be Guinevere, but even without the full figure, he makes a better president than a Guinevere, don't you think? Besides, he refused to wear the skirt." "Damn foolishness," said the president complacently. Miss Morgan laughed. "May I watch the rescue, Mr. Maltby?" "I'm not Mr. Maltby. I'm 300 Indians." The barking of foxes broke out again. "Over by the steps," said the 300 Indians. "You won't be taken for a redskin and massacred over there." He gazed towards the stream. A willow branch was shaking wildly. Junius scratched a match on his trousers and set fire to the brush at the foot of the stake. As the flame leaped up, the willow trees seemed to burst into pieces, and each piece became a shrieking boy. The mass charged forward, armed as haphazardly and as terribly as the French people were when they stormed the Bastille. Even as the fire licked towards the president, it was kicked violently aside. The rescuers unwound the ropes with fervent hands, and Jacob Stutz stood free and happy. Nor was the following ceremony less impressive than the rescue. As the boys stood at salute, the president marched down the line, and to each overall bib pinned a leaden slug on which the word hero was deeply scratched. The game was over. "Next Saturday, we hang the guilty villains who have attempted this dastardly plot," Robbie announced. "Why not now? Let's hang them now!" the troop screamed. "No, my men. There are lots of things to do. We have to make a gallows." He turned to his father. "I guess we'll have to hang both of you," he said. For a moment he looked covetously at Miss Morgan, and then reluctantly gave her up. That afternoon was one of the most pleasant Miss Morgan had ever spent. Although she was given a seat of honor on the sycamore limb, the boys had ceased to regard her as the teacher. "It's nicer if you take off your shoes," Robbie invited her, and it was nicer, she found, when her boots were off and her feet dangled in the water. That afternoon, Junius talked of cannibal societies among the Aleutian Indians. He told how the mercenaries turned against Carthage. He described the Lacedaemonians combing their hair before they died at Thermopylae. He explained the origin of macaroni and told of the discovery of copper, as though he had been there. Finally, when the dour Jacob opposed his idea of the eviction from the Garden of Eden, a mild quarrel broke out, and the boys started for home. Miss Morgan allowed them to distance her, for she wanted to think quietly about the strange gentleman. The day when the school board visited was looked forward to with terror by both the teacher and her pupils. It was a day of tense ceremony. Lessons were recited nervously, and the misspelling of a word seemed a capital crime. There was no day on which the children made more blunders, nor on which the teachers' nerves were thinner worn. The school board of the Pastures of Heaven visited on the afternoon of December the 15th. Immediately after lunch, they filed in, looking somber and funereal and a little ashamed. First came John Whiteside, the clerk, old and white-haired, with an easy attitude towards education, which was sometimes criticized in the valley. Pat Humbert came after him. Pat was elected because he wanted to be. He was a lonely man who had no initiative in meeting people and who took every possible means to be thrown into their contact. His clothes were as uncompromising, as unhappy, as the bronze suit on the seated statue of Lincoln in Washington. T.B. Allen followed, dumpily rolling up the aisle. Since he was the only merchant in the valley, his seat on the board belonged to him by right. Behind him strode Raymond Banks, big and jolly and very red of hands and face. Last in the line was Bert Monroe, the newly elected member. Since it was his first visit to the school, Bert seemed a little sheepish, and he followed the other members to their seats at the front of the room. When the board was seated magisterially, their wives came in and found seats at the back of the room behind the children. The pupils squirmed uneasily. They felt that they were surrounded, that escape, should the need come, was cut off. When they twisted in their seats, they saw that the women were smiling benevolently on them. They caught sight of a large paper bundle which Mrs. Monroe held on her lap. School opened. Miss Morgan, with a strained smile on her face, welcomed the school board. "We will do nothing out of the ordinary, gentlemen," she said. "I think it will be more interesting to you in your official capacities to see the school as it operates every day." Very little later, she wished she hadn't said that. Never, within her recollection, had she seen such stupid children. Those who did manage to force words past their frozen palates made the most hideous mistakes. Their spelling was abominable. Their reading sounded like the gibbering of the insane. The board tried to be dignified, but they could not help smiling a little from embarrassment for the children. A light perspiration formed on Miss Morgan's forehead. She had visions of being dismissed from her position by an outraged board. The wives in the rear smiled on nervously, and time dripped by. When the arithmetic had been muddled and travestied, John Whiteside arose from his chair. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," he said. "If you'll allow it, I'll just say a few words to the children, and then you can dismiss them. They ought to have some payment for having us here." The teacher sighed with relief. "Then you do understand they weren't doing as well as usual. I'm glad you know that." John Whiteside smiled. He had seen so many nervous young teachers on school board days. "If I thought they were doing their best, I'd close the school," he said. Then he spoke to the children for 5 minutes, told them that they should study hard and love their teacher. It was the short and painless little speech he had used for years. The older pupils had heard it often. When it was done, he asked the teacher to dismiss the school. The pupils filed quietly out, but once in the air, their relief was too much for them. With howls and shrieks, they did their best to kill each other by disembowelment and decapitation. John Whiteside shook hands with Miss Morgan. "We've never had a teacher who kept better order," he said kindly. "I think if you knew how much the children like you, you'd be embarrassed." "But they're good children," she insisted loyally. "They're awfully good children." "Of course," John Whiteside agreed. "By the way, how is the little Maltby boy getting along?" "Why, he's a bright youngster, a curious child. I think he has almost a brilliant mind." "We've been talking about him in board meeting, Miss Morgan. You know, of course, that his home life isn't all that it ought to be. I noticed him this afternoon especially. The poor child's hardly clothed." "Well, it's a strange home." Miss Morgan felt that she had to defend Junius. "It's not the usual kind of home, but it isn't bad." "Don't mistake me, Miss Morgan. We aren't going to interfere. We just thought we ought to give him a few things. His father's very poor, you know." "I know," she said gently. "Mrs. Monroe bought him a few clothes. If you'll call him in, we'll give them to him." "Oh, no, I wouldn't," she began. "Why not?" "We have only a few little shirts and a pair of overalls and some shoes." "But, Mr. Whiteside, it might embarrass him. He's He's quite a proud little chap. Embarrass him to have decent clothes? Nonsense. I think it should embarrass him more not to have them, but aside from that, it's too cold for him to go barefoot at this time of year. There's been frost on the ground every morning this week. I wish you wouldn't, she said helplessly. I really wish you wouldn't do it. Miss Morgan, don't you think you're making too much of this? Mrs. Monroe has been kind enough to buy the things for him. Please call him in so she can give them to him. A moment later, Robbie stood before them. His unkempt hair fell over his face, and his eyes still glittered with the fierceness of the play in the yard. The group gathered at the front of the room regarded him kindly, trying not to look too pointedly at his ragged clothes. Robbie gazed uneasily about.